Peter Charles here, Folk for Life Fly Fishing, and today let's talk about lifting sinking lines. And by that I mean both sink tips and full sinkers. Because what I see on the water, with some frequency, is people rolling up sink tips that maybe are only 10 foot long. And I even watched a video by a guy who was a pro who was doing a circle spey, and the first thing he did was he rolled up his 10 foot of T14, then he made the circle spey, and I'm going, why? Why did you bother? So there are ways to get these lines out of the water quite simply, and I'm not just talking sink tips, I'm talking full sinking lines too. I've got a video on YouTube of me fishing a 36-foot intermediate line on a 9-foot 4-weight, and I'm pulling it completely out of the water in one go with no roll cast. So the reality is, if you use good technique, you can get a full sinking line out of the water, no trouble. And it saves a lot of bother. I mean, you're not thrashing up the water with roll cast, you're not wasting energy, and you're not wasting time. You're just picking your line up and letting it go. Now, in this particular example I'm going to be showing, I'm going to be using a single spey, but the concepts here apply to everything. So the single spey is the hardest cast to lift a sinking line. And, we'll use the single spey as an example, but I routinely use single spays with sinking lines with no trouble and no roll cast. So let's get going. Now, in this example, I'm using a floating tip for visibility, and I'll stop it right there. I want to make a point here. If you're going to practice this, use an actual sink tip. It is tricky to get this to work well with a floating line because the floating line comes out of the water too easily. You need that resistance to make this easy, and you don't have that resistance with a floating tip. But I'm doing this with a floating tip so you have the ability to see what's going on, because with a sink tip it will just disappear against the dark water. So let's take a look at this cast, and it isn't perfect because a floating tip, but it's close to what I want. I made a very high lift, and I'm breaking the line out of the water. So what I've done is made my high lift, and it's a smooth high lift. I've started very slow, lifted nice, it starts nice and low, lifted nice and high. That breaks the line out of the water, and I do that slowly. I do not rush that. If you rush it, all you do is bend your rod. You're not moving the line very much because the line is well sunk. But you can move a well sunk line with a slow lift, and nice and high, and it'll break it clean of the water. So you don't have to worry about it. There's no need to rush. And then I start my sweep back. And again, I'm going slow. I'm not rushing this. It's a very gradual motion. I got to dip that rod back down again, because if I'm making my back cast, I can't be making a back cast with my rod high up in the air. I have to be making my back cast with the rod low. I have to get it back down again. And so this whole process of the lift up, the beginning of the sweep, and the drop has to be done slowly and smoothly. And you don't want to rush any part of that. So you're really just making that lift and sweep back, and you're starting that drop while the fly is still in the water. You don't want to try to do that drop when the fly has left the water. So all this happens, and the fly and maybe the end of the sinking line is still in the water. This is not going to be a perfect airplane landing, again, floating tip. But after I've dipped down, only then do I accelerate into the back cast. That's the key point to this whole process. If you accelerate too early, you'll see, I'll show you some examples of me. Sorry, I'm getting over COVID here. I still can't talk properly. You'll see some examples in a minute of me going too fast and accelerating too early and crashing the anchor. So we'll see some of that. So the acceleration into the back cast only happens after you've completed the dip. So this height here, right here, between the lift and the sweep part, there's the height of the lift, there's the height of the sweep. That lift varies according to the current and the line you're using. So if the current is strong, you don't have to lift as high. And if you're not using too much of a sink tip, you don't have to lift as high. But if I had a slow current and I had a really deeply sunk full sinking shooting head, I'd have to lift it way up high to clear it. So it's a judgment call, and it's a feel thing. You'll notice as you're lifting high, it's resisting. Oh, it's coming free. and you'll feel that the resistance drop as you lift. You're coming up with the rod and it's bending, and then suddenly you feel it start to relax. You're getting close to getting it completely out of the water, and that's when you get down into the dip. So those things are sort of feel, and you also look too to see what's going on. But you get used to that resistance, and you feel the resistance starting to drop as more of the line comes out of the water. So there's no standard height. I can't say do this and then do that because there's no standard height. It depends on the water conditions. Here's what's not to do. These are crashed anchors. And this is caused by accelerating down. So you've made your high lift, accelerating down. And you're going to get these horrible looking crashed anchors. And you get tangles and they're horrible messes, and everything gets scrunched together. And if it's, a fast sinking rig, it could end up on the bottom. This one folds backwards. If done deliberately, it's called a V anchor, but I'm not doing it deliberately. I'm crashing it. So that's not a neat one. You don't want to do that. That's horrible. And here is a perfect example of a nice smooth airplane landing, even done with a floating tip. And I've done the high lift, I've dropped, I've accelerated. And that's drop, then accelerate is how you get the smooth airplane landing of your anchor. And here it goes. Nice and flat and smooth, and boom, nice D-loop. Everything working just nicely. And lands perfectly flat. Everything comes together. And then I make my lift and away, my cast and away it goes. So, that was a single spey. And I routinely use single speys even with full sinking shooting heads without a roll cast. And even with 9-foot single handers, I'll do it. And it's that very slow high lift, drop it down, accelerate. And it works every time like charm. So in this example now, I'm working with a high slow lift using a double spey, and the same thing applies to a circle spey. And I'm using a 75-foot long intermediate long belly. The full head of that line is intermediate, so the full head sinks. And I've got about 50 feet out of the guides roughly at this point. So I've got, the remainder of the belly and the head is in the guides. And I'm able to do this without a roll cast. If I go more than 50 feet, I have to roll it up. About 55 is my total maximum. But there comes 50 feet of sunk intermediate line out of the water and on its way. And this is good for winter fishing where you don't want a lot of stripping. And the water at this stage probably was half a degree above freezing or something like that. So you really don't want to be stripping huge amounts of line back in. So you want to carry as much as you can. When I started going further with this cast, and because I don't want to shoot a lot of line, I was shooting maybe 20, 25 feet in this example. As I was working more line out, I started to roll cast this line up and then made my double spey and sent it on its way. But I could get up somewhere in that 50, 55 mark. I could get out of the water just on the double spey lift, and the same with the circle spey. The same thing applies. The circle spey and the double spey are great casts to use when you're using sinking lines, where the sink tips are full sinkers. You should never have to use a roll cast to get a sinking line out of the water with those two casts. And if you have to use a roll cast, well, I don't know how to tell you, but you're doing it wrong. You're rushing, and that's the reason why it's not coming out of the water. You're trying to snap it out of the water. And that's the interesting thing, is when we get sinking lines versus floaters, you see the guy make a nice smooth lift with the floater, and if he just did the same thing with his sinker, it would come out of the water, but he's got a sink rod, and all he's doing is bending his rod. So going even slower with the sinker is the way to get it out of the water and send it on its way without a roll cast. And, who can argue with that? So keep that in mind when you're out fishing with full sinking lines. Only roll cast them as a absolute, last resort. And in my example here, I had to do it because once I got around, it's a 13.5-foot rod. So once I get somewhere around 50, 55 feet out of the guides, I can't get it out of the water anymore without a roll cast. But, you know, up to 50 feet, I was good, no problem, consistent, everyone went. So if I can get 50 foot of sunk line out of the water with a 13.5 foot rod, yeah, you should be able to get 10 foot, right? Anyway, give that a try. Cheers.